Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. Manfred. In this dramatic poem of Byron's, one of the most powerful and remarkable productions of his singularly gifted mind, the fearful power of conscience is wonderfully portrayed. The omnipotence of the secret monitor is perhaps nowhere exhibited in stronger light except in some of the inspired writings where it is said, "The worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched," and "the smoke of their torment ascendeth up for ever and ever." How lamentable that such an intellect as Byron's should have been so perverted, that with such astonishing powers to spread an influence over other minds, so much of that influence should have been of a baneful character. True, there are many palliating circumstances in his life that call upon us to throw the veil of charity in some degree over the obliquities of his character, but this does not render the effect of a large portion of his writings any the less lamentable. The leading idea that runs through Manfred is the terrible writhing of an outraged conscience. Count Manfred, a being of high intellect and indomitable will, has been guilty of some monstrous but not very clearly defined crime, and wanders about the earth in the most awful agony, seeking for oblivion. He calls upon the spirits of the unbounded universe, all but the Great Supreme, and invokes them to bestow upon him forgetfulness, but none of them can aid him. They tell him he may die, but that will not bring forgetfulness, for they are immortal and do not forget. In some of his last agonies, demons assail him, but he defies their power. His language to them is, "I bear within a torture that could nothing gain from thine." The mind, which is immortal, makes itself requital for its good or evil thoughts, and is absorbed in sufferance or in joy, born from the knowledge of its own desert. The point of the poem, which is illustrated in the engraving, is where he has invoked and commanded spirits to appear to him, till at last one appears in the shape of a beautiful female figure. Manfred exclaims, "O God, if it be thus, and thou art not a madness and a mockery, I yet might be most happy. I will clasp thee, and we again will be—" Here the figure vanishes, and Manfred falls senseless. A voice is then heard to utter the following incantation, which for thrilling power and vigour of thought is hardly surpassed by anything in Shakespeare. When the moon is on the wave, and the glowworm in the grass, and the meteor on the grave, and the wisp on the morass, when the falling stars are shooting, and the answered owls are hooting, and the silent leaves are still in the shadow of the hill, shall my soul be up on thine, with a power and with a sign. Though thy slumber may be deep, yet thy spirit shall not sleep. There are shades which will not vanish, there are thoughts thou canst not banish. By a power to thee unknown, thou canst never be alone. Thou art wrapped as with a shroud, thou art gathered in a cloud, and for ever shalt thou dwell in the spirit of this spell. Though thou seest me not pass by, thou shalt feel me with thine eye, as a thing, as though unseen, must be near thee, and hath been. And when in that secret dread thou hast turned around thy head, thou shalt marvel I am not as thy shadow on the spot, thought, and the power which thou dost feel shall be what thou must conceal. And a magic voice and verse hath baptized thee with a curse, and a spirit of the air hath begirt thee with a snare. In the wind there is a voice shall forbid thee to rejoice, and to thee shall night deny all the quiet of her sky. And the day shall have a sun, which shall make thee wish it done. From thy false tears I did distil an essence which hath strength to kill. From thy own heart I then did wring the black blood in its blackest spring. From thy own smile I snatched a snake, for there it coiled as in a brake. From thy own lip I drew the charm, which gave all their chiefest harm. Improving every poison known, I found the strongest was thine own. By thy cold breast and serpent smile, by thy unfathomed gulfs of guile, by that most seeming virtuous eye, by thy shut soul's hypocrisy, by the perfection of thine art, which passed for human thine own heart, by thy delight in others' pain, and by thy brotherhood of Cain, I call upon thee, and compel thyself to be thy proper hell. And on thy head I pour a vial, which doth devote thee to this trial, nor to slumber, nor to die, shall be in thy destiny. Though thy death shall still seem near to thy wish, but as a fear, lo, the spell now works around thee, and the clankless chain hath bound thee. O'er thy heart and brain together hath the word been passed, now whither? The next scene presents to us Manfred alone upon the cliffs of the mountains of Jungfrau, complaining that the spirits which he has raised abandon him, and the spells which he has studied baffles him. The entire scene which follows is one of terrific grandeur and beauty. We dare say that no person who has ever read this wonderful poem has failed to be deeply impressed with its powerful and thrilling language, and at this moment it would be difficult to call to mind many productions of modern days that will bear reading so often. Those of our readers, we think, who study our engravings, cannot but admire the boldness and vigour of the artist's conception, and its truthfulness to the awful subject which it illustrates. How seriously are we led to reflect upon what the mighty genius of Byron could have effected had his moral faculties not been blighted in the bright springtime of his youth. End of section 1. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2, The Black Night. The dark night of the forest, so from his armor named, and sable helm, whose unbared visor mortal never saw. The storm still raged with unabated violence, and the wind, as it howled around him, dashed to and fro the waving plumes upon the helmet of the night. But he heeded it not, and continued to urge his coal-black steed toward the dark and gloomy forest. The wind stayed its fury for a space, and the moon broke suddenly between two warring clouds, as if she would have calmed with her soft holy light the furious tempest that was raging around. That momentary light gave to view the knight upon his coal-black steed entering the precincts of the forest. As darkness again closed, the sound of approaching steeds was heard, and a deep, hoarse voice exclaimed, "Curses on the storm! Is there no place of shelter nearer than your father's castle, lady?" "Swear not," replied a soft female voice, "swear not, Count Gondibert, lest you bring down heaven's vengeance on our heads. There is no place of shelter save this forest, and I will not enter it." "Why fear you this, fair lady?" replied the other. "Am I not here to guard and to protect you? Can you fear the straggling bandits who infest it?" "It is no human power I fear, my lord," replied the soft voice. "It is a shuddering dread of another kind. Hast thou forgotten the legend of the forest, how a brave knight was basely murdered there, returning to his young and lovely bride by a revengeful and disappointed rival? I cannot enter it, my lord. I'll rather brave the fury of the storm. Hark, hark, the sound of horses' feet is beating in the forest." Count Gondibert listened, but before he had time to prepare for defence, there was a rush from its dark bosom, and in a moment they were surrounded by horsemen. The Lady Bertha shrieked. Count Gondibert drew his sword and called on his attendants to defend themselves. They quickly drew forth their firearms, but fear or the darkness prevented their making a vigorous defence against their assailants, and they began to give way. One of the robbers laid his hand upon the bridle of the Lady Bertha's palfrey, while Count Gondibert in vain endeavoured to defend and to release her, but it was done by another hand. One blow from a stranger's sword severed the arm from the body, and the Lady Bertha's steed was released. On all sides the banditti felt the power of a strong arm, but darkness prevented them from distinctly seeing the form which dealt these strokes of death. Unprepared for this attack, from the feeble resistance which had at first been made, terror seized the banditti, and they fled before that arm of power. The moon again shone forth. It was the knight on his coal-black steed. "It is the knight of the forest," shrieked Bertha, and hid her face with her trembling hands. Count Gondibert shuddered, and laid his hand on the lady's bridle to lead her away, but the knight also laid his hand upon it, and it fell from that of the Count. Count Gondibert spoke not. The Lady Bertha trembled with affright, and the knight in silence led the palfrey toward the castle of her father, Baron Adelbrecht von Edelstein. They arrived at the castle gates and paused, for the horn of warning hung on the side where the Black Knight rode, and no one dared to approach it. For a moment they were immovable, but at last the knight raised the horn to his lips. The tones pierced Lady Bertha's heart. They seemed mysteriously to awaken remembrances of past scenes, feelings of mingled pleasure and of pain. She felt as if the spirits of those she had once loved were hovering around her to guard her from the evils of a turbulent world from which her pure spirit would gladly have fled for ever. These feelings overpowered her already agitated mind, and when the gates were opened she was taken in an almost insensible state from her saddle. The knight on his coal-black steed slowly retraced his way toward the forest, and Baron Adelbrecht, receiving his fainting daughter in his arms, eagerly inquired the cause of the situation in which he beheld her. Count Gondibert related the adventure. The Baron looked disturbed and asked whether the knight wore sable armour and rode a black horse. "He did," replied Count Gondibert. "Didst thou remember to utter a prayer?" asked the Baron solemnly. Count Gondibert started. "Beware of that knight, Count Gondibert. Canst thou forget the tradition that the fate of thy house depends on such a form? Shouldst thou meet him 3 times and forget to utter a prayer, thou art lost." The Count remained in gloomy silence. The Baron now dismissed Bertha, who had revived, to her chamber, and turning with a smile toward the Count, he inquired what progress he had made in Bertha's affections during the time of their residence together at the castle of her uncle, whence they had just returned. Count Gondibert contracted his brows, and a dark fire flashed from under them as he answered in a haughty tone that the Lady Bertha had peremptorily refused to listen to his suit, and he feared he must aspire to no more than her friendship. Her love, added he with a bitter smile, still appears to be buried in the grave of the page. The Baron frowned, but smoothing his features, he said, "It is nearly a year, Count Gondibert, since the mysterious death of Albert, and Bertha may surely now be one to think of a lover more befitting her than an unknown boy. She speaks not of him, she seems to lament him not." The Baron was here interrupted by the soft sound of a lute, and Bertha's voice was heard singing in tones of deep feeling the following song: "This mournful heart can dream of naught but thee, as with slow steps among these shades I move, and hear the nightingale from tree to tree, sighing, I love, I love. This mournful heart wakes to one thought alone, that still our fatal parting will renew, to hear that bird, when spring's last eve is gone, sighing, adieu, adieu." The Baron said no more, and the conference was broken up. The following morning Count Gondibert sought an interview with the Lady Bertha, and renewed his suit, but she repulsed him with indignation and displeasure at his thus breaking through the solemn promise he had made her never to resume the hated subject. The Count sprung on his steed and galloped from the castle, rage and vengeance burning in his breast. Absorbed in dark reflections, he drew near the forest without observing that he did so. "She shall be mine," exclaimed he aloud, "were all the powers of darkness leagued against me." "They may assist thee," said a deep voice beside him. He looked up. The knight on his coal-black steed was there. He shrunk back and muttered a prayer, though prayer was a stranger to his lips. In silence he rode, and the Black Knight by his side, till he arrived at his own castle gates, when the knight slowly retraced his way to the forest. A superstitious terror scarcely now permitted Count Gondibert to leave his castle, lest he should again encounter the Black Knight, but it did not hinder him from laying plans for the accomplishment of his diabolical purpose. "My mind is sad today," said Bertha to her attendant, "and I feel a wish to recline on the banks of the dark rolling Danube. The deep shade of its trees will be in accordance with the sadness of my soul." "Ah, my lady," replied Matilda, "I too feel this heaviness upon me, as if some misfortune were impending over us, but I shrink from the thoughts of that sombre spot, which, without increasing our cheerfulness, must lay us open to 1,000 dangers. Go not to it, my lady. Rather from the secure battlements of your father's castle, let us look out upon the surrounding rich variety of prospect, which cannot fail to cheer and revive our drooping spirits." But Bertha would not listen to Matilda's remonstrances, and turned her steps toward the dark stream. Scarcely were they within the shade of the forest, though whose boughs waved mournfully in the sighing breeze, when Bertha felt the gloom deepening in her mind, and sad thoughts, which filled her eyes with tears, came crowding fast upon her. "Ah, Matilda," said she as they proceeded, "how like is this shade to my darkened life! I felt the morning light of joy behind, and there remains for me but the night of grief." At that moment she felt herself enveloped in a close covering, which obscured her sight and stifled her voice. She heard the shriek of Matilda, but she heard no more, for a powerful arm was thrown around her. She was hurried along, placed on a steed before a horseman, and borne swiftly away. Long did they ride, at a rapid pace, but at last the horseman paused, and removing the covering a little, he raised some wine to Bertha's lips. She turned her head aside and refused to drink it. "Take it," said the horseman. "It may help to sustain you in what you have yet to undergo." Merciful heaven, exclaimed she, for what am I doomed? Tell me, by all your hopes of heaven, for what am I reserved? Drive me not, I implore thee, to despair. Innocence should never despair, said the horseman sternly, and again raised the wine to her lips. His words insensibly infused courage into the bosom of Bertha, and raising her thoughts to heaven in prayer, she took the offered beverage to renew her fast-failing strength. At length they stopped, and she was taken from the steed by the horseman. A horn was sounded low, and she heard the clanking of the chains of a drawbridge letting down. She shuddered, but remembering the words of the horseman, innocence should never despair, she made no resistance, and suffered herself to be led across the bridge into what she imagined to be the courtyard of a castle. A door was opened, and her conductor led her down a flight of steps. "Oh, heaven," thought she, "is it to a dungeon I am to be taken?" But she spoke not. After descending some steps they kept upon level ground, then ascended a long staircase, and her guide put a key into a door, which seemed to bar their further progress. He opened it, and drawing Bertha within, said, "You may remove the bandage," but before she could do so he had retreated and locked the door behind him. In place of a dungeon, she now found herself in a magnificent apartment. She gazed around her in astonishment, but something like the truth flashing upon her mind, she exclaimed, "Rather to a dungeon." She now threw herself upon a couch, and endeavoured to strengthen her mind for what she expected would soon follow, but she was interrupted in her reflections by the opening of a door at the other end of the apartment. A female entered, and approached Bertha, who knew not in what light to consider her, as she appeared to be too elegantly attired for an attendant. "Why am I here?" asked Bertha, rising with some haughtiness in her air. "And who dares thus to treat a daughter of the Baron von Edelstein?" The female made no reply to her question, but surveyed Bertha with a scrutinizing glance, and the result of her observations was not evidently pleasure. There was something about this female which made Bertha shrink and turn away from her gaze. The dark foreign look, the large black eye of fire, the compressed lip, for a moment alarmed Bertha, but the dignity of innocence could not forsake her, and offended at the insolent survey, she turned her clear but dove-like eyes upon her. The bold eyes sunk under that calm look. "For what purpose am I here?" repeated Bertha. "I am appointed to attend you," replied the female, "not to answer your questions. Supper waits. Will it please you to partake of it?" Bertha only waved her hand in silence, and again sunk upon the sofa in tears. "Here is your apartment, when you choose to retire," opening a door near to where Bertha sat. Bertha made no reply, and with a haughty step the other left the room. On entering the chamber, she examined every window and door, but they were all firmly secured. There lay no hope that way, and, throwing herself down on the couch without undressing, her weary spirit was soon calmed in deep sleep. Bertha awoke not until the morning was far advanced, and soon after the female she had seen the preceding evening entered, and inquired how she had rested. "I rested well," said Bertha. "What, did terror and despair not keep you from rest?" inquired she with a contemptuous smile. "Innocence should never despair," said Bertha calmly. The eyes of the female flashed fire, and she looked steadfastly upon Bertha, whose serene, innocent countenance, indicating no reproof, she resumed her composure, and showed Bertha into an adjoining room. For some days she saw no one save this woman, who, relaxing little in her insolence of manner, Bertha asked no more questions, and there was an almost total silence observed on both sides. One evening, however, she appeared to be singularly agitated, and paced the room involuntarily, clasping her hands, as if bitter thoughts crossed her, and occasionally gazing on Bertha with a bewildered glance, who now began to be alarmed. The female perceived it, and immediately calming her emotion, she took a lute from the table and commenced tuning it. Her hand trembled as she swept the chords, but it was a hand that knew to touch it well, and she sung the following song with an unsteady voice. The wind howls wild in the hollow oak, breathing its anthem drear. The raven pours with answering croak the boding notes of fear. The shrieks, the sobbings of despair are bursting through the midnight air. The startled eagle soaring springs high from his cliffy home. The screaming sea-fowl flaps her wings o'er surging billows foam, and bursts of woe and moanings deep are echoing round the beetling steep. Shrill screams and low heart-rending moans rise on the troubled gale. O human anguish swells these tones, 'tis a lovelorn maiden's wail. And the heart heaves sick, and the blood runs chill, as ye list to a wail so wild and shrill. Still creaks and moans the hollow oak when the storm sweeps through the wood, and the raven pours his boding croak when he scents the smell of blood. And the prey birds scream for their dire repast when a warrior's form from the rocks is cast. But the maiden's wail, 'tis silent now. Her tears, they are wiped away. A mantling flush laughs o'er her brow, and there's joy in her eyes' bright ray. She smiles at the tale that her new lover sighs, while all forgotten the lost youth lies. Albert, Albert, exclaimed Bertha, wringing her hands and rushing up to the singer. Woman, she continued, who has persuaded thee to torture a heart already almost broken with grief? Who dares say that Albert is forgotten? The female appeared, awed for a moment, then fixing her eyes upon Bertha. Swear to me, she cried, that he is still remembered. Swear to me that you will resist Count Gondibert, even unto death, and a way for escape may yet be found. Indignation sparkled for a moment in Bertha's eye, as if she would have said, Wretch, thou knowest not the pure constancy of a virtuous woman's love. But repressing her feelings, she replied, My constancy is firm unto death. I never will be Count Gondibert's bride. A tear for the first time appeared in those large black eyes. Then I shall be your friend. Resist and fear not. Saying which, she rose precipitately and left the apartment. Bertha threw herself upon a sofa and wept, but she was soon roused by a heavy footstep in the chamber. She started up, and Count Gondibert stood before her. He forcibly seized her hand, which she in vain attempted to withdraw. I have cursed the moments that have kept me from thee, said he, but now that I am with thee, nothing shall tear us asunder, till thou art mine, thou loved, though scornful one. Base, unmanly villain, exclaimed Bertha, dashing him from her, I command thee to restore me to my father. Darest thou in thy dastard soul ever to hope for my consent? Away, traitor, nor dare to lay thy coward hand upon me. Resistance is in vain, cried the Count, enraged at her contempt. This night seize you my bride. Nothing can rescue you from my power. In 3 hours everything will be ready. Prepare to submit in silence to your inevitable fate. Monster, no power shall make me thine. Heaven will protect me. Trust in heaven, then, replied he, with a scornful laugh, for no earthly aid can reach you, saying which he left the apartment, and Bertha trembled at the fate which seemed to await her. 2 hours passed away in dreadful agitation, and Bertha began to fear that the promised assistance of the female attendant was in vain, when at last she hastily entered the apartment. Motioning Bertha to keep silence, she proceeded to array her in bridal garments and threw a long white veil over her. She had scarcely completed these arrangements when the door was opened and Count Gondibert appeared. All is ready, said the Count. I come to lead my bride to the altar. Villain, I will not, said Bertha, grasping the sofa. Approach me not, at thy peril. Carry the lady into the hall, said the Count, turning to his attendants. They approached the terrified Bertha, and amid her struggles and cries to heaven for succor, they bore her into the hall. The hall was hung with tapestry, and but dimly lighted. A large mirror was on one side, before which stood the priest who was to perform the ceremony. If thou art a true minister of our religion, cried Bertha. I charge thee in the name of heaven from aiding in this most unholy design. Peace, exclaimed the Count, stamping violently. Proceed, added he, addressing the priest, who now opened the book. Stop, I command you, again cried Bertha. Oh, aid me, heaven. As she uttered these words, she raised her eyes, and the figure of an armed warrior met them, reflected in the opposite mirror. It was that of the Black Knight, and Bertha, uttering a heart-piercing shriek, fell lifeless on the floor. The Count grasped his sword, but the lights were suddenly extinguished, and the deep tones of a well-remembered voice near him made his blood run cold. Where is thy prayer, Gondibert? It inquired. Another time, and thy fate is sealed. Lights were soon brought by some of the terrified attendants. All remained apparently undisturbed in the hall, save the unhappy victim, who, closely enveloped in her veil, lay extended on a sofa. Ha! exclaimed the Count, on observing her. Bertha still here? Then I defy the powers of light and darkness. She shall yet be mine. Proceed. The ceremony shall now be completed. Motionless, she was raised from the sofa, and apparently having no power to resist, the priest performed his office. The Count approached and raised the veil. Damnation burst from his lips. He struck the frail form to the ground and rushed from the hall. It was the mysterious female whom we have formerly noticed. Bertha was gone. When Bertha recovered from the swoon into which she had fallen, she found herself in her father's castle, supported by him and surrounded by her anxious attendants. Heaven be praised, said the Baron. My child revives. Bertha slowly raised her eyes and looked bewildered around. Where am I? Cried she. Then perceiving her father, she threw her arms round him and wept on his bosom. Who has restored me to thee, my dear father? Who has saved your child from so horrid a fate? What fate, my child? You know it not then, but, she added wildly, who brought me here? The Black Knight brought you to the castle gate and blew a fearful blast. He spoke not, and on his coal-black steed he slowly retraced his way to the forest. The Black Knight of the forest, shuddered Bertha. She then related to the Baron, Count Gondibert's cowardly baseness, and the dreadful fate which had been averted. The Baron's proud eye flashed fire. Gondibert shall rue this deed, but tell me all, my child. Bertha began her relation, but on reaching that part where the female attendant had sung, her voice faltered. Again assuming courage, she exclaimed with much emotion, O my father, my heart is in Albert's grave. Since his disappearance from the castle and the dreadful death he is said to have met with, I have known no happiness, no peace, no rest. I can never love another. The Baron's brows contracted, and his indignation rose. Shame on thee, Bertha, a page, an unknown low-born boy. Shame, shame on thee to confess it. Father, said she, raising herself proudly, he was no low-born boy. She paused, her voice again faltered. Why should I now conceal it, since he is no more? He was the son of Berthold, thy deadliest foe. The Baron started from his seat. His eye flashed on the pale-cheeked maiden, who bent like a lily at the threatening blast. My deadliest foe, and my daughter loved him? Where was the noble blood that should have risen to revenge thy father's wrongs? I cast thee from me. Thou lovest not thy father, or thou would have hated his bitterest enemy. O my father, cried Bertha, clasping her hands, Albert was not thy enemy. He knew his father injured thee, and he lamented it. He came to thy castle as a deserted youth to seek thy kind protection, and by services of love to make thee reparation for a father's faults. He saw and loved me. Father, forgive us. I am restored to thee as by a miracle. O cast me not from thy bosom, from thy protecting arms. The Baron sought to subdue his emotion, but casting a glance of displeasure on Bertha, he hastily left the apartment without replying to her appeal. Exasperated at the villainous conduct of Count Gondibert, the Baron determined to attack him in his castle and punish his unmanly attempt. But the Count, having heard that Bertha was restored, and conjecturing what would be the consequences when the Baron was informed of his conduct, he resolved not to await the result. One night, therefore, when all in the castle of the Baron were buried in sleep with a strong force, he attempted to surprise it, and to carry off the Lady Bertha. The alarm was given. All flew to arms, but they were taken unprepared, and their numbers being greatly inferior, they gave way before their assailants, who had already forced the gates. To the tower, shouted Gondibert. Seize the Lady Bertha. And he rushed to the staircase which the Baron bravely defended. Young and powerful, and instigated by double motives of love and revenge, Gondibert bore down all opposition, and having cut his way to the Baron, he had just aimed a thrust at his breast when his arm was struck down with violence, and the Black Knight stood before him. Again, exclaimed the Count, may all the powers of vengeance seize thee, aiming a blow in desperation at the sable figure. Thy fate is sealed, said a deep voice, and one stroke from a powerful arm laid Gondibert bleeding on the ground. Confess thy sins before thy treacherous soul takes its eternal flight, said the Black Knight as he bent over his victim. Make reparation for thy misdeeds. The Lady Bertha rushed from the tower. My father, she cried, I will die with thee. But on beholding the scene, she stood riveted to the ground. The knight's sword still hung suspended over the fallen Gondibert. Confess, again said his deep-toned voice. Gondibert half raised himself. Lady, I would make thee reparation. Albert died not. He is in the dungeons of my castle. Albert is here, said the Black Knight, as he raised his helmet. Gondibert's spirit fled. Bertha shrieked and fell into her father's arms. The Baron's breast heaved convulsively. He stood irresolute. Albert advanced toward him and sunk on his knee. My father injured thee in the duty and faithfulness of a son. Permit me to atone for those injuries. Thrice have I saved the Lady Bertha from worse than death. Let the good deeds I may have done thee, and my constancy and sufferings, be repaid by her hand. Baron Adalbert von Edelstein, dost thou grant my suit? The Baron's struggles were past. He put the Lady Bertha's hand in that of the youthful warrior, and turned aside to hide a starting tear. End of section 2.
Section 3 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. The Haunted Manor-House. The mail coach has just set me down at the entrance to a dreary and unweeded avenue. There was a double row of dark elms, interspersed with beech, neither very bowery nor very umbrageous, though as I passed, they saluted me with a rich shower of wet leaves, and shook their bare arms, growling as the loud sough of the wind went through their decayed branches. The old house was before me. Its numerous and irregularly contrived compartments in front were streaked in black and white zigzags. Van Dyked, I think the fairest jewels of the creation call this chaste and elegant ornament. It was near the close of a dark autumnal day, and a mass of gable ends stood sharp and erect against the wild and lowering sky. Each of these pinnacles could once boast of its admired and appropriate ornament, a little weathercock, but they had cast off their gilded plumage forever, and fallen from their high estate like the once neatly trimmed mansion which I was now visiting. A magpie was perched upon a huge stack of chimneys. His black and white plumage seemed perfectly in character with the mottled edifice at his feet. Perhaps he was the wraith, the departing vision of the decaying fabric, an apparition, unsubstantial as the honours and dignities of the ancient and revered house of Etherington. I looked eagerly at the long, low casements. A faint glimmer was visible. It proceeded only from the wan reflection of a sickly sunbeam behind me, struggling through the cleft of a dark hail cloud. It was the window where in my boyhood I had often peeped at the village clock through my little telescope. It was the nursery chamber, and no wonder that it was regarded with feelings of the deepest interest. Here the first dawnings of reason broke in upon my soul. The first faint gleams of intelligence awakened me from a state of infantine unconsciousness. It was here that I first drank eagerly of the fresh rills of knowledge. Here my imagination, ardent and unrepressed, first plumed its wings for flight, and I stepped forth over its thresholds into a world long since tried and found as unsatisfying and unreal as the false glimmer that now mocked me from the hall of my fathers. A truce to sentiment. I came hither, it may be, for a different purpose. A temporary gush will occasionally spring up from the first well-head of our affections. However homely and seemingly ill-adapted in outward show and character for giving birth to those feelings generally designated by the epithet romantic, the place where we first breathed, where our ideas were first molded, formed, and assimilated, as it were, to the condition of the surrounding atmosphere, their very shape and color determined by the medium in which they first sprung. The casual recurrence of a scene like this, forming part and parcel of our very existence, and incorporated with the very fabric of our thoughts, must, in spite of all subsequent impressions, revive those feelings, however long they may have been dormant, with a force and vividness which the bare recollection can never excite. The garden gate stood open. The initials of my name, still legible, appeared rudely carved on the posts. A boyish propensity which most of us have indulged, and I well remember ministering to its gratification, wherever I durst hazard the experiment, when first initiated into the mystery of hewing out these important letters with a rusty penknife. Not a creature was stirring. In the nature of the present occupants, whether sylphs, gnomes, or genii, was a question not at all, as it yet appeared, in a train for solution. The front door was closed, but as I knew every turn and corner about the house, I made doubt of soon finding out its inmates, if any of them were in the neighborhood. I worked my way through the garden, knee-deep and rank with weed, for the purpose of reconnoitering the back offices. I steered pretty cautiously past what memory, that great dealer in hyperbole, had hitherto pretty generally contrived to picture as a huge lake, now, to my astonishment, dwindled into a duck-pond, but not without danger from its slippery margin. It still reposed under the shadow of the cherry tree, once the harbinger of delight, as the returning season gave intimation of another bountiful supply of fruit. Its gnarled stump, now stunted and decaying, had scarcely one token of life upon its scattered branches. Following a narrow walk, nearly obliterated, I entered a paved court. The first tramp awoke a train of echoes that seemed as though they had slumbered since my departure, and now started from their sleep to greet or to admonish the returning truant. Grass in luxuriant tufts, capriciously disposed, grew about in large patches. The breeze passed heavily by, rustling the dark swaths and murmuring fitfully as it departed. Desolation seemed to have marked the spot for her own, the grim abode of solitude and despair. During 20 years' sojourn in a strange land, memory had still, with untiring delight, painted the old mansion in all its primeval primness and simplicity, fresh as I had left it, full of buoyancy and delight, to take possession of the paradise which imagination had created. I had indeed been informed that at my father's death it became the habitation of a stranger, but no intelligence as to its present condition had ever reached me. Being at L, and only some 50 miles distant, I could not resist the temptation of once more gazing on the old manor-house, and of comparing its present aspect with that but too faithfully engrafted on my recollections. To all appearance, the house was tenantless. I tried the door of a side kitchen or scullery. It was fastened, but the rusty bolts yielded to no very forcible pressure, and I once more penetrated into the kitchen. That exhaustless magazine, which had furnished ham and eggs, greens and bacon, with other sundry and necessary condiments, thereto appertaining to the progenitors of our race for at least 2 centuries. A marvellous change! To me it appeared as if wrought in a moment, so recently had memory reinstated the scenes of my youth in all their pristine splendor. Now no smoke rolled lazily away from the heavy billet, no blaze greeted my sight, no savory steam regaled the sense. Dark, cheerless cold, the long bars emitted no radiance, the hearth unswept, on which Growler once panted with health and fatness. Though night was fast approaching, I could not resist the temptation of once more exploring the deserted chamber, the scene of many a youthful frolic. I sprang with reckless facility up the vast staircase. The shallow steps were not sufficiently accommodating to my impatience, and I leaped, rather than ran, with the intention of paying my first visit to that cockaigne of childhood, that paradise of little fools, the nursery. How small, dwindled almost into a span, appeared that once mighty and almost boundless apartment, every nook of which was a separate territory, every drawer and cupboard the boundary of another kingdom. 3 or 4 strides brought me to the window. The village steeple still rose abruptly from the dark fir trees, peacefully reposing in the dim and heavy twilight. The clock was chiming. What a host of recollections were awakened at the sound! Days and hours, long forgotten, seemed to rise up at its voice, like the spirits of the departed sweeping by, awful and indistinct. These impressions soon became more vivid. They rushed on with greater rapidity. I turned from the window, and was startled at the sudden moving of a shadow. It was a faint, long, drawn figure of myself, on the floor and opposite wall. Ashamed of my fears, I was preparing to quit the apartment, when my attention was arrested by a drawing which I had once scrawled, and stuck against the wall with all the ardor of a first achievement. It owed its preservation to an unlucky but effectual contrivance of mine for securing its perpetuity. A paste-brush, purloined from the kitchen, had made all fast, and the piece, impregnable to all attacks, withstood every effort for its removal. In fact, this could not be accomplished without at the same time tearing off a portion from the dingy papering of the room, and leaving a disagreeable void instead of my sprawling performance. With the less evil it appeared each succeeding occupant had been contented, and the drawing stood its ground in spite of dust and dilapidation. I felt wishful for the possession of so valuable a memorial of past exploits. I examined it again and again, but not a single corner betrayed symptoms of lesion. It stuck bolt upright, and the dun squat figures portrayed on it appeared to leer at me most provokingly. Not a slip or tear presented itself as vantage ground for the projected attack, and I had no other resource left of getting possession than what may be denominated the Caesarean mode. I accordingly took out my knife, and commenced operations by cutting out, at the same time, a portion of the ornamental papering from the wall, commensurate with the picture. I looked upon it with a sort of superstitious reverence, and I have always thought that the strong and eager impulse I felt for the possession of this hideous daub proceeded from a far different source than mere fondness for the memorials of childhood. Be that as it may, I am a firm believer in a special providence, and that, too, as discovered in the most trivial as well as the most important concerns of life. It was while cutting down upon what seemed like wainscoting over which the room had been papered, that my knife glanced on something much harder than the rest. Turning aside my spoils, I saw what through the dusk appeared very like the hinge of a concealed door. My curiosity was roused, and I made a hasty pull, which at once drew down a mighty fragment from the wall, consisting of plaster, paper, and rotten canvas, and some minutes elapsed ere the subsiding cloud of dust enabled me to discern the terra incognita I had just uncovered. Sure enough there was a door, and as surely did the spirit of enterprise prompt me to open it. With difficulty I accomplished my purpose. It yielded at length to my efforts, but the noise of the half-corroded hinges, grating and shrieking on the rusty pivots, may be conceived as sufficiently dismal and appalling. I know not if once at least I did not draw back, or let go my hold, incontinently as the din grew long and loud. I own, without hesitation, that I turned away my head from the opening, as it became wider and wider at every pull, and it required a considerable effort before I could summon the requisite courage to look into the gap. My head seemed as difficult to move as the door. I cannot say that I was absolutely afraid of ghosts, but I was afraid of a peep from behind the door, afraid of being frightened. At length, with desperate boldness, I thrust my head plump into the chasm. Now, reader, what was it, thinkest thou, that I beheld? Thy speculation on this subject will, of course, depend entirely upon thy nerves and constitution, likewise upon thy course of education and habits of study. If, as in all probability thou art of the gender feminine, and little addicted to romance, poetry, and the like, then wilt thou tickle thine imagination with delightful guesses about a white lady, a lamp, and a dagger. If thy brain hath been steeped in the savory brine of novel reading and sentimentality, then will thy thoughts be of gloomy rooms, prisoners immured by unfeeling relatives, etc. Shouldst thou happen to be cast in a more matter-of-fact mould, strongly addicted to cry "Fudge!" at every display of trickery and folly, then mayest thou opine, what any man with 3 grains of sense would have guessed long since, that it was nothing but a cupboard. I might thus frame solutions proper to every character and temperament. As the fool thinks, etc., is a trite proverb, but suffice it to say, not one of these fancies and speculations I take upon myself to affirm is correct. As before mentioned, I thrust my head suddenly into the chasm, more startled at the noise produced by the celerity of my own motions than I could possibly be at anything that was visible. As far as the darkness would permit, I explored the interior, which, after all, is neither more nor less than a small closet. From what cause it had been shut out from the apartment to which it belonged, it were vain to conjecture. All that was really cognizant to the senses presented itself in the shape of a shallow closet, some 4 feet by 2, utterly unfurnished, save with some inches of accumulated dust and rubbish, that made it a work of great peril to grope out the fact of its otherwise absolute emptiness. This discovery, like many other notable enterprises, seemed to lead to nothing. I stepped out of my den, reeking with spoils which I had much rather left undisturbed in their dark recesses. Preparing for my departure, and a visit to my relation in the village, who as yet had no other intimation of my arrival than a hasty note, to apprise him that I had once more set foot on English ground, and intended to visit him before my return, I stepped again to the window. Darkness was fast gathering about me. A heavy scud was driven rapidly across the heavens, and the wind wailed in short and mournful gusts past the chamber. The avenue was just visible from the spot where I stood, and looking down, I thought I could discern more than one dark object moving apparently toward the house. It may be readily conceived that I gazed with more than ordinary interest as they approached, and it was not long ere 2 beings, in human habiliments, were distinctly seen at a short distance from the gate by which I had entered. Feeling myself an intruder, and not being very satisfactorily prepared to account for my forcible entry into the premises, and the injury I had committed on the property of a stranger, I drew hastily aside, determined to effect a retreat whenever and wherever it might be in my power. Door and window alternately presented themselves for the accomplishment of this unpleasant purpose, but before I could satisfy myself as to which was the more eligible offer, as doubters generally do contrive it, I lost all chance of availing myself of either. Facilis to census, easier in than out, etc., occurred to me, and many other classical allusions, much more appropriate than agreeable. I heard voices and footsteps in the hall. The stairs creaked, and it was but too evident they were coming. Surely, thought I, these gentry have noses like the sleuth-hound, and I made no doubt but they would undeviatingly follow them into the very scene of my labors. And what excuse could I make for the havoc I had committed? I stood stupefied and unable to move. The thoughts of being hauled neck and heels before the next justice, on a charge of housebreaking, mayhap, committed to prison, tried, perhaps, and the sequel was more than even imagination durst conceive. Recoiling in horror from the picture, it was with something like instinctive desperation that I flew to the little closet and shut myself in, with all the speed and precision my fears would allow. Sure enough, the brutes were making the best of their way into the chamber, and every moment I expected they would track their victim to his hiding place. After a few moments of inconceivable agony, I was relieved at finding from their conversation that no notion was entertained, at present, of any witness to their proceedings. "I tell thee, Gilbert, these rusty locks can keep nothing safe. It is but some few months since we were here, and thou knowest the doors were all fast. The kitchen door post is now as rotten as touchwood. No bolt will fasten it." "Nail it up, nail 'em all up," growled Gilbert. "Nobody'll live here now, or else set fire to it. It'll make a rare bonfire to burn that ugly old will in." A boisterous laugh here broke from the remorseless Gilbert. It fell upon my ear as something with which I had once been disagreeably familiar. The voice of the first speaker, too, seemed to sound like the echoes of childhood. A friendly chink permitted me to gain the information I sought. There stood my uncle and his trusty familiar. In my youth I had contracted a somewhat unaccountable aversion to the latter personage. I well remembered his downcast gray eye, deprived of its fellow, and the malignant pleasure he took in thwarting and disturbing my childish amusements. This prepossessing cyclop held a tinder-box, and was preparing to light a match. My uncle's figure I could not mistake. A score of winters had cast their shadows on his brow since we had separated, but he still stood as he was wont, tall, erect, and muscular, though age had slightly drooped his proud forehead, and I could discern his long-lapped waistcoat somewhat less conspicuous in front. He was my mother's brother, and the only surviving relative on whom I had any claim. My fears were set at rest, but curiosity stole into their place. I felt an irrepressible inclination to watch their proceedings, though eavesdropping was a procedure that I abhorred. I should, I am confident, at least I hope so, have immediately discovered myself, and not a single word which I had overheard prevented me. The will to which they had alluded might to me, perhaps, be an object of no trivial importance. "I wish with all my heart it weren't burnt," said my uncle. "The will or the house?" peevishly retorted Gilbert. "Both!" cried the other, with an emphasis and expression that made me tremble. "If we burn the house, the papers will not rise out of it, depend on't, master," continued Gilbert, "and that box in the next closet will not be like Goody Blake's salamander that she talks about." I began to feel particularly uncomfortable. "I wish they had all been burnt long ago," said mine honest uncle. After a pause he went on, "This scapegoat nephew of mine will be here shortly. For fear of accidents, I say, Gilbert, it were better to have all safe. Who knows what may be lurking in the old house, to rise up some day as a witness against us? I intend either to pull it down or set fire to it. But we'll make sure of the will first." "A rambling jackanapes of a nephew," said Gilbert. "I hope the fishes have been at supper on him before now." "We never thought, master, he could be alive, as he sent no word about his being either alive or dead. But I guess," continued this amiable servant, "he might have stayed longer, and you wouldn't have fretted for his company." Listeners hear no good of themselves, but I determined to reward the old villain very shortly for his good wishes. "Gilbert, when there's work to do, thou art always readier with thy tongue than with thy fingers. Look, the match has gone out twice. Leaving off puffing and fetch the box. I'll manage the candle." I began to feel a strange sensation rambling about me. Gilbert left the room, however, and I applied myself with redoubled diligence to the crevice. My dishonest relation proceeded to revive the expiring sparks. The light shone full upon his hard features. It might be fancy, but guilt, broad, legible, remorseless guilt, seemed to mark every inflection of his visage. His brow contracted, his eye turned cautiously and fearfully round the apartment, and more than once it rested upon the gap I had made. I saw him strike his hand upon his puckered brow, and a stifled groan escaped him. But as if ashamed of his better feelings, he clenched it in an attitude of defiance, and listened eagerly for the return of his servant. The slow footsteps of Gilbert soon announced his approach, and apparently with some heavy burden. He threw it on the floor, and I heard a key applied and the rusty wards answering to the touch. The business in which they were now engaged was out of my limited sphere of vision. "I think, master, the damps will soon ding down the old house. Look at the wall. The paper hangs for all the world like a clerk's wig. Ha, ha! If we should burn the whole big 'un, we'd write it out of the ghosts. Would they stand fire, think you, or be off to cooler quarters?" "Hush, Gilbert! Thou art wicked enough to bring a whole legion upon us, if they be within hearing." I always seem to treat these stories with contempt, Gilbert, but I never could very well account for the noises that old Dobbins and his wife heard. Thou knowest he was driven out of the house by them. People wondered that I did not come and live here, instead of letting it run to ruin. It's pretty generally thought that I fear nothing, man nor devil. But oh, here it is. Here is the will. I care nothing for the rest, provided this be cancelled. "Aye, master. They said the ghost never left off scratching as long as anybody was in the room. Which room was it, I wonder? I never thought on't to inquire, but I don't like this a bit. It runs in my head. It is the very place. And behind that wall, too, where it took up its quarters, like as it might be just a back of the paper there. Think you, master, the old tyke has pulled it down with scratching?" "Gilbert," said my uncle solemnly, "I don't like these jests of thine. Save them, I prithee, for fitter subjects. The will is what we came for. Let us dispose of that quietly, and I promise thee I'll never set foot here again." As he spoke, he approached the candle. It was just within my view, and opened the will, that it might yield more readily to the blaze. I watched him evidently preparing to consume a document with which I felt convinced my welfare and interests were intimately connected. There was not a moment to be lost. But how to get possession was no easy contrivance. If I sallied forth to its rescue, they might murder me, or at least prevent its falling into my hands. This plan could only prolong its existence a few moments, and would, to a certainty, ensure its eventual destruction. Gilbert's dissertation on the occupations and amusements of the ghost came very opportunely to my aid, and immediately I put into execution what now appeared my only hope of its safety. Just as a corner of the paper was entering the flame, I gave a pretty loud scratch, at the same time anxiously observing the effect it might produce. I was overjoyed to find the ennui intimidated, at least by the first fire. Another volley, and another succeeded, until even the skeptical Gilbert was dismayed. My uncle seemed riveted to the spot. His hands widely disparted, so that the flame and its destined prey were now pretty far asunder. Neither of the culprits spoke, and I hoped that little more would be necessary to rout them fairly from the field. And yet they did not seem disposed to move, and I was afraid of a rally, should reason get the better of their fears. "Rats! Rats!" shouted Gilbert. "We'll singe their tails for them." The scratching ceased. Again the paper was approaching to its dreaded catastrophe. "Beware!" I cried, in a deep and sepulchral tone that startled even the utterer. What effect it had produced on my auditory I was left alone to conjecture. The candle dropped from the incendiary's grasp, and the spoil was left a prey to the bugbear that possessed their imaginations. With feelings of unmixed delight, I heard them clear the stairs at a few leaps, run through the hall, and soon afterward a terrific bellow from Gilbert announced their descent into the avenue. Luckily the light was not extinct, and I lost no time in taking possession of the document, which I considered of the most importance. A number of loose papers, the contents of a huge trunk, were scattered about, but my attention was more particularly directed to the paper which had been the object of my uncle's visit to Etherington House. To my great joy, this was neither less nor more than my father's will, witnessed and sealed in due form, wherein the possessions of my ancestors were conveyed, absolutely and unconditionally, without entail, unencumbered, and unembarrassed, to me and my assigns. I thought it most likely that the papers in and about the trunk might be of use, either as corroborative evidence, in case my uncle should choose to litigate the point and brand the original document as a forgery, or as a direct testimony to the validity of my claim. I was rather puzzled in what manner to convey them from the place so as not to excite suspicion should the two worthies return. I was pretty certain they would not leave matters as they now stood, when their fears were allayed, and daylight would probably impart sufficient courage to induce them to repeat their visit. On finding the papers removed, the nature of this night's ghostly admonition would immediately be guessed, and measures taken to thwart any proceedings which it might be in my power to adopt. To prevent discovery, I hit upon the following expedient. I sorted out the waste paper, a considerable quantity of which served as envelopes to the rest, setting fire to it in such a manner that the contents of the trunk might appear to have been destroyed by the falling of the candle. I succeeded very much to my own satisfaction. Disturbed and agonized as my feelings had been during the discovery, the idea of having defeated the plan of my iniquitous relative gave a zest to my acquisitions almost as great as if I had already taken possession of my paternal inheritance. Before I left the apartment, I poured out my heart in thanksgivings to that unseen power whose hand, I am fairly convinced, brought me thither at so critical a moment, to frustrate the schemes and machinations of the enemy. Bundling up the papers, my knowledge of the vicinity enabled me to reach a small tavern in the neighborhood without the risk of being recognized. Here I continued 2 or 3 days, examining the documents, with the assistance of an honest limb of the law from W. He entertained considerable doubts as to the issue of a trial, feeling convinced that a forged will would be prepared, if not already in existence, and that my relative would not relinquish his fraudulent claim should the law be openly appealed to. Mr. Latitat strongly recommended that proceedings of a different nature should be first tried, in hopes of enclosing the villain in his own toils, and these, if successful, would save the uncertain and expensive process of a suit. I felt unwilling to adopt any mode of attack but that of open warfare, and urged that possession of the real will would be sufficient to reinstate me as the lawful heir. The man of law smiled. He inquired how I should be able to prove that the forgery which my uncle would in all probability produce was not the genuine testament, and as the date would inevitably be subsequent to the one I held, it would annul any former bequest. As to my tale about burning the will, that might or might not be treated as a story trumped up for the occasion. I had no witnesses to prove the fact, and though appearances were certainly in my favor, yet the case could only be decided according to evidence. With great reluctance I consented to take a part in the scheme he chalked out for my guidance, and on the 3rd day from my arrival I walked a few miles from the village, returning by the mail, that it might appear as if I had only just arrived. On being set down at my uncle's, I had the satisfaction to find, as far as could be gathered from his manner, that he had no idea of my recent sojourn in the neighborhood. Of course, the conversation turned on the death of my revered parents, and the way in which their property had been disposed of. I can only repeat, continued he, what I, as the only executor under your father's will, was commissioned to inform you at his decease. The property was heavily mortgaged before your departure, and its continued depression in value, arising from causes that could not have been foreseen, left the executor no other alternative but that of giving the creditors possession. The will is here, said he, taking out a paper neatly folded and mounted with red tape from a bureau. It is necessarily brief, and merely enumerates the names of the mortgagees and amounts owing. I was unfortunately the principal creditor, having been a considerable loser from my wish to preserve the property inviolate. For the credit of the family I paid off the remaining encumbrances, and the estate has lapsed to me as the lawful possessor. He placed the document in my hands. I read in it a very technical tribute of testamentary gratitude to Matthew Somerville, Esquire, styled therein beloved brother, and a slight mention of my name, but no bequest, save that of recommending me to the kindness of my relative, in case it should please Heaven to send me once more to my native shores. I was aware he would be on the watch, guarded therefore against any expression of my feelings. I eagerly perused the deed, and with a sigh, which he would naturally attribute to any cause but the real one, I returned it to his hands. I find, said he, from your letter received on the 23rd current, that you are not making a long stay in this neighborhood. It is better, perhaps, that you should not. The old house is sadly out of repair. 3 years ago next May, David Dobbins, the tenant under lease from me, left it, and I have not yet been able to meet with another occupant fully to my satisfaction. Indeed, I have some intention of pulling down the house and disposing of the materials. Pulling it down? I exclaimed, with indignation. Yes, that is, it is so untenable, so what shall I call it, that nobody cares to live there. I hope it is not haunted. Haunted? Exclaimed he, surveying me with a severe and scrutinizing glance. What should have put that into your head? I was afraid I had said too much, and anxious to allay the suspicion I saw gathering in his countenance. Nay, uncle, I quickly rejoined, but you seemed so afraid of speaking out upon the matter, that I thought there must needs be a ghost at the bottom of it. Ah, as for that, said he carelessly, the foolish farmer and his wife did hint something of the sort, but it is well known that I pay no attention to such tales. The long and the short of it, I fancy, was that they were tired of their bargain, and wanted me to take it off their hands. Here honest Gilbert entered, to say that Mr. Latitat would be glad to have a word with his master. Tell Mr. Latitat to walk in. We have no secrets here. Excuse me, nephew. This man is one of our lawyers from W. He has nothing to communicate but what you may hear, I dare say. If he should have any private business, you can step into the next room. The attorney entering, I was introduced as nephew to Mr. Somerville, just arrived from the Indies, and so forth. Standing, Mr. Latitat performed due obeisance. Sit down, Mr. Latitat, cried my uncle. You need not be bowing there for a job. Poor fellow, he has not much left to grease the paws of a lawyer. Well, sir, your errand. I came, Mr. Somerville, respecting the manor-house. Perhaps you will not have any objections to a tenant. I cannot say just now. I have had some thoughts of pulling it down. Sir, you would not demolish a building, the growth of centuries, a family mansion, been in descent since James's time. It would be barbarous. The antiques would be about your ears. I care nothing for the antiquities, and moreover, I do not choose to let the house. Any further business with me this morning, sir? Nothing of consequence. I only came about the house. Pray, Mr. Latitat, said I, what sort of a tenant have you in view? One you could recommend. I think my uncle has more regard for the old mansion house of the Etheringtons than comports with the outrage he threatens. The will says, if I read aright, that the house and property may be sold, should the executor see fit. But as to pulling it down, I am sure my father never meant anything so deplorable. Allow me another glance at that paper. Please to observe, nephew, that the will makes it mine, and as such I have a right to dispose of the whole in such manner as I may deem best. If you have any doubts, I refer you to Mr. Latatat, who sits smiling at your unlawyer-like opinions." "Pray, allow me one moment," said the curious Mr. Latatat. He looked at the signature, and that of the parties witnessing. "Martha Somerville, your late sister, I presume?" My uncle nodded assent. "Gilbert Buntwhistle, your servant." "The same." "To what purpose, sir, are these questions?" angrily inquired my uncle. "Merely matters of form, a habit we lawyers cannot easily throw aside whenever we get sight of musty parchments. I hope you will pardon my freedom." "Oh, as for that, you are welcome to ask as many questions as you think proper. They will be easily answered, I take it." "Doubtless," said the persevering man of words. "Whenever I take up a deed, for instance, it is just the habit of the thing, Mr. Somerville. I always look at it as a banker looks at a note. He could not, for the life of him, gather one up without first ascertaining that it was genuine." "Genuine!" exclaimed my uncle, thrown off his guard. "You do not suspect that I have forged it?" "Forged it? How could that enter your head, Mr. Somerville? I should as soon suspect you of forging a banknote or coining a guinea. Ringing a guinea, Mr. Somerville, does not at all imply that the payee suspects the payer to be an adept in that ingenious and much abused art. We should be prodigiously surprised, Mr. Somerville, if the payer was to start up in a tantrum and say, 'Do you suspect me, sir, of having coined it?'" "Mr. Latatat, if you came hither for the purpose of insulting me—" "I came here on no such business, Mr. Somerville. But as you seem disposed to be captious, I will make free to say, and it would be the opinion of 99 hundredths of the profession, that it might possibly have been a little more satisfactory to the heir apparent had the witnesses to this the most solemn and important act of a man's life been any other than, firstly, a defunct sister to the party claiming the whole residue, and secondly, Mr. Gilbert Buntwhistle, his servant. Nay, Mr. Somerville," said the pertinacious lawyer, rising, "I do not wish to use more circumlocution than is necessary. I have stated my suspicions, and if you are an honest man, you can have no objections, at least, to satisfy your nephew on the subject, who seems to say the truth, much astonished at our accidental parley." "And pray, who made you a ruler and a judge between us?" "I have no business with it, I own. But as you seem rather angry, I made bold to give an opinion on the little technicalities aforesaid. If Mr. Etherington chooses," addressing himself to me, "the matter is now at rest." "Of course," I replied, "Mr. Somerville will be ready to give every satisfaction that may be required, as regards the validity of the witnesses. I request, uncle, that you will not lose one moment in rebutting these insinuations. For your own sake and mine, it is not proper that your conduct should go forth to the world in the shape in which this gentleman may think fit to represent it." "If he dare speak one word—" "Nay, uncle, that is not the way to stop folks' mouths nowadays. Nothing but the actual gag, or a line of conduct that courts no favor and requires no concealment, will pass current with the world. I request, sir," addressing myself to Latatat, "that you will not leave the house until you have given Mr. Somerville the opportunity of cleaning himself from any blame in this transaction." "As matters have assumed this posture," said Mr. Latatat, "I should be deficient in respect to the profession of which I have the honor to be a member, did I not justify my conduct in the best manner I am able. Have I liberty to proceed?" "Proceed as you like. You will not prove the testament to be a forgery. The signing and witnessing were done in my presence," said Mr. Somerville. He rose from his chair, instinctively locked up his bureau, and, if such stern features could assume an aspect of still greater asperity, it was when the interrogator thus continued: "You were, as you observe, Mr. Somerville, a witness to the due subscription of this deed. If I am to clear myself from the imputation of unjustifiable curiosity, I must beg leave to examine yourself and the surviving witness apart merely as to the minutiae of the circumstances under which it was finally completed. For instance, was the late Mr. Etherington in bed? Was he sick or well when the deed was executed? A cadaverous hue stole over the dark features of the culprit, their aspect varying and distorted, in which fear and deadly anger painfully strove for preeminence. "And wherefore apart?" said he, with a hideous grin. He stamped suddenly on the floor. "If that summons be for your servant, you might have saved yourself the trouble, Mr. Somerville," said Rat-a-tat with great coolness and intrepidity. "Gilbert is at my office, whither I sent him on an errand, thinking he would be at best out of the way for a while. I find, however, that we shall have need of him. It is as well, nevertheless, that he is out of the reach of signals." "A base conspiracy!" roared the infuriated villain. "Nephew, how is this? And in my own house, bullied, baited! But I will be revenged, I will." Here he became exhausted with rage and sat down. On Mr. Rat-a-tat attempting to speak, he cried out, "I will answer no questions, and I defy you. Gilbert may say what he likes, but he cannot contradict my words. I'll speak none." "These would be strange words indeed, Mr. Somerville, from an innocent man." "Know you that will?" said the lawyer, in a voice of thunder, at the same time exhibiting the real instrument so miraculously preserved from destruction. I shall never forget his first look of horror and astonishment. Had a spectre risen up, arrayed in all the terrors of the prison house, he could not have exhibited more appalling symptoms of unmitigated despair. He shuddered audibly. It was the very crisis of his agony. A portentous silence ensued. Some minutes elapsed before it was interrupted. Mr. Rat-a-tat was the first to break so disagreeable a pause. "Mr. Somerville, it is useless to carry on this scene of duplicity. Neither party would be benefited by it. You have forged that deed. We have sufficient evidence of your attempt to destroy this document I now hold, in the very mansion which your unhallowed hands would, but for the direct interposition of Providence, have leveled with the dust. On one condition, and on only one, your conduct shall be concealed from the knowledge of your fellow men. The eye of Providence alone has hitherto tracked the tortuous course of your villainy. On one condition, I say, the past is forever concealed from the eye of the world." Another pause. My uncle groaned in the agony of his spirit. Had his heart's blood been at stake, he could not have evinced a greater reluctance than he now showed at the thoughts of relinquishing his ill-gotten wealth. "What is it?" "Destroy with your own hands that forged testimony of your guilt. Your nephew does not wish to bring an old man's gray hairs to an ignominious grave." He took the deed, and, turning aside his head, committed it to the flames. He appeared to breathe more freely when it was consumed, but the struggle had been too severe even for his unyielding frame, iron-bound though it seemed. As he turned trembling from the hearth, he sank into his chair, threw his hands over his face, and groaned deeply. The next moment he fixed his eyes steadily on me. A glassy brightness suddenly shot over them. A dimness followed like the shadows of death. He held out his hand, his head bowed, and he bade adieu to the world and its interests forever. End of Section 3. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 4 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Gini, Rosario. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. Edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 4. The First and Last Robbery. "I will not, I cannot endure the scene any longer," said Robert Dawson to himself, as his 4 children, he had a 5th, but it was at the breast, one day clung around him, imploring something wherewith to satisfy the cravings of hunger. "I cannot endure it longer. I must, by some means or other, get bread for the poor things." There was not a man within the confines of Banffshire of more strict integrity than Robert Dawson. Though never affluent, he had from his youth up until now been in comfortable circumstances. His late reverse of fortune involved no compromise of principle. It was produced by causes over which he had no control. He had embarked his all in a speculation which everybody thought would prove a profitable one. The issue showed how erroneous human calculations sometimes are. He was all at once reduced to extreme poverty, and himself, his wife, and family subjected to all its attendant wants and woes. For some months Robert and his partner in life bore up under their sad and sudden reverse with a fortitude which exceeded all praise. Not a murmur was heard to escape the lips of either, and as far as they themselves were concerned, they would have continued reconciled to their condition, in the hope, though against hope, that a brighter and better day would ultimately dawn on them. But they had children, and these gathered round the mother, who had been for weeks stretched on a pallet of straw, imploring, by the irresistible eloquence of their looks, their cries, their tears, something wherewith to allay all the gnawings of hunger. For days Robert witnessed the scene with feelings which do not admit of description. At last it pierced his soul so sharply that he could no longer endure it. The independence of his spirit sank before it. He came to the resolution. He uttered the words recorded above. He sallied forth to appeal to the charitable and humane. He who is the subject of real and deep distress is generally less qualified to tell his tale of woe with effect than the person whose wants and wretchedness are only fictitious. Such was the case with Robert Dawson, and the consequence was that the application for assistance was in every instance unsuccessful. What was to be done? His apparently dying wife and famishing children were again pictured to his mind in all the soul-touching wretchedness of their situation. He feared if no food were given them in an hour or two, one or more of them, by that time, would be lying a corpse. A feeling of desperation came over him. He hurried to an adjacent wood, determined to rob the first individual he met in that secluded place, though death, either on the spot or by the hands of the hangman, should be the consequence. An opportunity soon presented itself of carrying his resolution into effect. He espied a gentleman walking on foot along the road which went through the wood. Unacquainted with the feelings and practices of a footpad, Robert's breast palpitated and his limbs quivered as he observed the gentleman approach the place where he lay concealed. His determination, however, was fixed, and as the gentleman came up, he leaped out from his hiding-place, seized the traveler by the collar, and demanded his purse. Observing that Robert had no pistol, nor even so much as a stick in his hand, the other resisted. A struggle ensued. Robert tripped up the gentleman, and when on the ground succeeded by his superior physical strength in taking from his pocket a 5-pound note. Robert then allowed the other to rise and depart, and set off himself for home to give his wife and family the benefit of his booty. He had not proceeded many yards on his way when his conscience loudly condemned him for the robbery he had committed. A violent struggle ensued in his breast between honesty and commiseration for his famishing wife and children. The decision he came to was that he would not take what was not his own, but would trust to Providence. He that moment turned from his homeward course. He ran as fast as he could after the gentleman. He overtook him and placed the 5-pound note in his hand. "Sir," said he, "here is your money. I have done wrong in taking it. I could not be at ease until I restored it. Nothing but the direst necessity could ever have made me form, far less execute, the purpose of robbing a fellow man. From my most inmost soul, I beg your pardon." Robert wheeled round to withdraw when he had restored the money, but the gentleman, struck by his appearance and his manner, desired him to stay for a moment or two. "Your conduct surprises me," said the gentleman. "What could have induced you to take the highway, and then, after having succeeded, at the risk of your own life, in getting part of my money, to come and restore it? It is not often that footpads trouble themselves about the honesty of their practice." "Sir," said Robert emphatically, "I am no footpad. You are the first I have ever attempted to rob in my life." "Your manner convinces me of that," remarked the other. "Pray tell me what is it that has made you form the resolution of committing robbery?" "A sick, perhaps dying wife, and 5 young and helpless children, sir." It was with difficulty, from the swellings of Robert's breast, that the words obtained an utterance. "Poor man, I feel for your and their condition," said the gentleman. "Do your wife and family reside far from this?" he added. "About 1.5 miles, sir," was the answer. "Will you allow me to accompany you to your home to witness the affecting scene?" continued the stranger. "The sight would only hurt your feelings," answered Robert. The gentleman persisted in the expression of his desire to see the repentant robber's wife and family. The latter at last assented, and both proceeded to the house of woe. The scene which the stranger now witnessed baffles description. All his previous conceptions of destitution and distress shrank before it. Exhausted from her protracted abstinence from anything in the shape of food, Robert's wife lay on a bed of straw in a dark corner of a fireless apartment, seemingly unconscious of the presence of either her husband or the stranger. The sucking infant lay at her breast, restless and crying for nourishment. The 2 eldest children were moving about like perfect skeletons. The moment their father appeared, they set up a loud cry for something to eat. The process of starvation was well nigh completed in the case of the other 2 children. They were lying together among a few rags beside the bed, if it deserved the name, of their mother. The gentleman's heart was too full from the scene which he witnessed for speaking much. "Take that," said he to the husband and father, putting the 5 pounds, which had been restored to him, into Robert's hand. "Take that. I am come from abroad, and am going to reside in this part of the country. I will see what can be done for you." He departed. Robert's sense of gratitude to his unknown benefactor was too deep to permit an audible expression of it. Robert, that instant, went and procured food and fuel with part of the money thus put, as if by a miracle, into his hand. He brought home some wine to his wife and the 2 children whose sufferings from want had been greatest. In the space of 3 hours, each of the sufferers were manifestly in the way of recovery. In an hour afterward, the unknown benevolent gentleman returned, bringing with him a female from a neighboring village to attend on Robert's family. He had previously given the woman a 2-pound note, giving her strict instructions to provide everything for the family which their necessities required. Robert Dawson was lost in astonishment at this excess of benevolence on the part of a gentleman he had never before seen, and his distressed wife, as consciousness returned, was equally lost in wonder and gratitude. The female stayed up all night at Robert's house, and by breakfast time next day the whole family were so far recovered as to look altogether different beings from what they were when the stranger first saw them. In the forenoon he returned. A glow of satisfaction lighted up his countenance as he witnessed the altered condition of the family. The mother, with her sucking infant on her knee, sat in a chair by a comfortable fire. He sat down beside her. "Do you not know me?" said he, looking her in the face. "No, sir, indeed I know not," answered Mrs. Dawson. "Have you no recollection of seeing my face before?" The poor woman looked at her own and family's benefactor again. "I think I have," she said with much modesty and softness of tone. "Do you not recollect your brother, James?" The words went to her heart. She swooned away in her chair. She soon, however, recovered her consciousness. The strange gentleman was her brother. He had gone to India 22 years before. He had returned, quite unexpectedly, with an ample fortune. He was on his way, on foot, from the town at which the stagecoach had stopped, to B, his native village, when Robert robbed him. After visiting the house of woe the first time, he proceeded to his native village. His first inquiries were naturally about his sister, for she was the only one he had. He learned, with the deepest pain, the reverses which had befallen herself and family, and their consequent privations. A description of the personal appearance of her husband and the place of residence served to satisfy him that it was his brother-in-law he had encountered in the wood of F, and that it was his sister and her children who were suffering the frightful distress he had witnessed in the house he had visited. He concealed his convictions, however, from his informant at the inn, and deeming the discovery might be too much for the feelings of his sister on the second visit, he prudently abstained at that time from making known his relationship to her. From that day to the day of their several deaths, neither Robert Dawson, his wife, nor family knew what want was. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5, Life on the Gulf of Mexico by E.K. Sketch 3. The Pestilence. Ye who reside in princely dwellings, surrounded by all that wealth can produce, to cheat life of its cares, from whose view the shadows of existence are carefully excluded, ye whose abiding places are the summits of the alpine bridges of life, catching the first and retaining the last rays of the glittering meteors that mislead and delude. Ye whose manners are polished as the ice, and whose hearts are hardened by prosperity into the impenetrable glaciers. Ye who have never descended into the rugged declivities of the lower region of this moral mountain, know not the privations, the self-denials, the resolution necessary to perform the toilsome pilgrimage in submission and without repining. Early in the fall of 1834, a brig might be seen making her way into the beautiful harbor of Pensacola. As she neared the town, her sails were lazily furled, and an air of languor seemed to pervade her crew. Whence she came, no one knew. The yellow flag of the health officer was nowhere visible. The authorities, yielding perhaps to the enervating effects of a long summer, or lulled into security by years of uninterrupted exemption from disease, had ceased to inquire of the whereabouts of newcomers. The arrival, therefore, passed unnoticed. The winds for several weeks had been from the east, bearing on the unseen pinions the malaria from the swamps on the Escambia River. These swamps are some 20 miles from the city, at the mouth of the Escambia, and in ordinary times were never thought of, but a continuation of easterly winds seldom failed to excite anticipation of evil among the old inhabitants of Pensacola. On a sultry morning, soon after the arrival of the above-mentioned brig, which by this time was known to be a French merchantman last from Veracruz, a boat might be seen passing to and from the shore, loaded with the bedding and clothes of the crew. These were deposited and sunned on the beach immediately in front of the town, the easterly wind sweeping over them in their progress, and gathering to their unseen store the odor and effluvia shook out from cabin, hold, and cargo of this dread visitant. No notice, however, was taken of this procedure of the brig, or rather no interference was made by those whose duty it was to watch over the inhabitants. Bonjour, Jose. How are you this morning? Ah, madame, I no like this wind, and what for de French sailors' son dare beds on shore. It is no good, madame. The health of Pensacola at the time to which we allude had been so extraordinary that months elapsed without a death occurring among its inhabitants. Mournfully and startling, therefore, sounded the funeral note proclaiming the decease of Merced, wife of our neighbor Jose. But 2 of her children followed in the procession to the church. It was customary upon these occasions to array the body of the dead in their best attire, not only gloves to the hand, but shoes to the feet. If a young person, flowers were strewed over the coffin, a bouquet in the hand, and a wreath encircled the brow. The coffin, covered with white cloth, ornamented with blue ribbons, remained uncovered until after the solemnities were gone through in church, and the procession ready to proceed to the graveyard. The 4 ribbons extending from the corners were several yards in length, the extremities held by 4 young persons, male or female, according to the sex of the deceased. If a girl, the bearers were all clothed in white and veiled. At the moment of leaving the house, a candle wrapped round the end with paper was handed to every individual in the procession. Upon arriving at the church, these were blessed, and the corpse nearly saturated with holy water. This was also sprinkled over those assembled near it. According to the means of paying was the value of the crucifix borne aloft by the sexton. The officiating priest, bearing in his hand his missal, recited aloud the prayers for the dead. The richness of his robes and those of the acolytes corresponded to that material of which the crucifix was made. This was either of solid silver, decorated with black crape, or of wood, painted black. The tolling of the bells was in unison with these distinctions. For the rich, at the moment of departure, the 3 death notes pealed forth at the moving of the procession, and again in the evening, immediately succeeding vesper. If the deceased was an elderly person and a female, the attendants were shrouded in veils of black crape, no change being necessary in their dress, for it was always black. The reason given for the non-attendance of Merced's other children was that they and their mother had been performing a penance of uncommon severity, that she had fallen a victim, and that they were so much exhausted as to be unable to leave the house. In 2 days, however, they left the house, borne to the church on the shoulders of their companions. I stood at my door, as the sisters for the last time occupied a space in God's holy temple, sympathizing truly with their bereaved father. That night an ague seized me, and then for days fever and delirium reigned triumphant. So burning was the heat, and so altered my appearance, that my infant rejected nature's nourishment, and would not even look at me. Our only physician was on a visit to the north. His apothecary's shop, in the meantime, was left in charge of his wife, and during her necessary absences to a mulatto girl. This curiosity shop we propose to sketch in a future number. 2 ships of war were in port, and my husband at once endeavored to procure the assistance of one or other of their surgeons. The difficulty of finding them on shore was great. My husband therefore procured a small boat and went on board soliciting the attendance of her surgeon. This gentleman promised to visit me as soon as practicable, and in the meanwhile prescribed in accordance with the described symptoms. The next day he called and left prescriptions to meet certain changes which he predicted. The next day he did not come on shore, but Dr. called in his stead, leaving his prescriptions to meet a crisis as it might occur. 4 times in 5 days these gentlemen visited me, and by their skill in foreseeing the certain changes of the disease, together with the best of nursing from my husband, for I had no other, I was rescued from the grasp of the destroyer, he in whose hands are life and death, blessing their endeavors. During my illness our children were all indisposed, remedies were given, and they escaped a severe attack. Our second girl, however, refused all nourishment, and all medicines likewise. She would be regularly dressed every morning, and stretching herself out on 3 chairs, for our habitation was very small, absolutely starved out the disease, and recovered as soon as the rest. It was known at this time that the crews of the ships of war were suffering from sickness. Several deaths occurred on board, but the eyes of our people seemed blinded to the truth. It was a solemn sight, the procession of boats, from the ships the broad stripes and bright stars of his country's flag enfolding the coffin of the humblest sailor, and appealing to the hearts of his countrymen in that far-off land, for the sympathy he had relinquished at his own hearth for their sakes. Several families were watching with anxiety their different members succumbing to the disease, which as yet had received no name. No death had followed those in Jose's family, and imagination had a powerful influence in unnerving those who were attacked at a later period. Dr. McLeod, an assistant surgeon in the Navy, was at this time invaliding at the Navy Yard, and it being known that the town was without a physician, he applied for permission to volunteer his services. This at first was refused, and but reluctantly granted upon the reiterated petition of our citizens. My husband was now attacked, and became so violently ill that apprehensions were entertained of his recovery. Dr. McLeod's attentions, however, were unremitting, and in the end successful. The sickness was now so general, and the doctor's health still so feeble, that it was necessary for him to ride from house to house. A horse was therefore kept saddled day and night, and lonely and terrible was the sound as that solitary horseman galloped through the streets at the midnight hour, for his speed was sometimes for life or death. In an old Spanish house was now lying the corpse of the schoolmaster, and when the friends assembled to bury it, which was in a few hours after death, great was the difficulty as to the manner of bringing out the coffin. The staircase was so narrow and steep, and the turning so abrupt, it was impossible to descend it. A strong rope was therefore procured, and bound firmly round the coffin. A plank was then placed against the front gallery, and down this it was carefully lowered to the ground. The bells of the Episcopal Church tolled forth its solemn requiem. With the first sound, my husband sprang from his bed, and in spite of all remonstrances, dressed himself, and putting on his overcoat, staggered into the street, to ascertain, as he said, whether he were alive or dead. It was God's mercy that he was not also borne out to the place of the dead. The terrible words were this day proclaimed, yellow fever was among us. So long as no name had been given, the disease, with 1 or 2 exceptions, yielded to medicine, but now a visible destroyer could not have struck down more rapidly his victims. The tolling of the bells had so injurious an effect that they were prohibited, so that when they again sounded for a funeral, it was the signal of deliverance. In the deep, dark well, bright stars may be seen, shining at noonday. In the dark and trying hour of adversity and affliction, the gems of the human heart shine forth. Miss N, from adverse circumstances, and through the entreaties of some of our most respectable citizens, have been induced to open a school for young ladies. After a toilsome summer, the vacation had now commenced, and she anticipated several pleasant excursions in order to recruit her health. One of her pupils boarded with her at the house of our pastor. This young girl was taken dangerously ill, and being an orphan, her case excited general sympathy. Extreme illness in the house of her relative, Major W., prevented them from rendering any assistance. She was therefore cast upon the tender mercies of strangers. The clergyman and his wife, being recently from the north, were terrified from their propriety by apprehension, and when called upon to pray with poor Fanny, as we supposed in her last extremity, he would not enter her room, but knelt at the door, and she reclined upon a couch, utterly helpless. Not so Miss N. Night and day her hand smoothed the pillow of the sufferer, and her hand administered the soothing draught or refreshing beverage to cool the parched lips. At length the crisis approached. One morning Fanny broke forth into inarticulate muttering. Gradually her voice assumed a clear tone, and she told distinctly a narrative that had interested her. The tears rained down the cheeks of Miss N, for well she knew what this ray of reason betokened. As the tale drew to a close, Fanny's voice gradually lowered. Her limbs were stretched out, her arms laid straight by her side, the eyes closed, the jaws became fixed and rigid, and to all appearance death had transferred the orphan to her parents. I was requested to go to the stores and procure whatever was necessary for preparing the body for burial, and the old nurse of Fanny had gone for assistance to lay out the dead. Mrs. W., her aunt, came rushing in from the bedside of her own daughter, who was but just emerging into convalescence, to kiss for the last time the cold lips of the dying. At this moment my husband and a friend, who had witnessed much of the yellow fever in New Orleans, came in, and after looking attentively at what we supposed the corpse, said, "She is not dead, and she will recover. This is the crisis. Let her not be disturbed, and in a few hours she will revive." Strange as it may appear, without moving a muscle, the body gradually assumed an appearance of life. A mirror held over the mouth became clouded. The heart resumed its pulsations, and before midnight Fanny was able to partake of slight nourishment. Although feeble herself, Miss N, during this anxious period, had been entirely deprived of her natural rest, and it was only when relieved by some friend that she snatched a few moments' repose. Persuading her for this night to yield her watch to another, she accompanied me home. Spreading a pallet for my children, I arranged their little room for her reception and a sounder night's rest I doubt if she ever enjoyed. Besides many other persons, 2 ladies of high respectability were now almost hopelessly ill. Troubles of their own prevented many of their friends from assistance, but in several cases families resolutely closed their doors and embargoed themselves completely. These had as yet escaped sickness. One of these ladies had for several days been nursed entirely by her husband and waiting maid. Both of these were exhausted, and Dr. MacLeod begged Miss N, for God's sake, to go and take her place at the bedside of Mrs. C, who would die if not carefully watched. Without hesitation she complied, and her time for days was divided between Mrs. C and Mrs. W, the aunt of Fanny, who was lying in the last extremity. One day a request came to me to know if I would sit up that night with Mrs. W. Miss N was worn out, and no help could be procured. Accordingly, after seeing my little ones in bed and placing the infant in its father's arms, our servants were both ill, I proceeded to the house of Major W. One look was sufficient to convince me that the unfortunate sufferer could not possibly survive. Her nephew, Dr. M., and myself sat silently in the gloomy death chamber until after midnight. It was necessary then for one to return home, and Miss N was again called to the performance of her most disinterested duty. Mrs. W. died the next night, leaving a void in the hearts of her numerous friends that her virtues alone can fill. No Sœur de Charité ever devoted herself more unreservedly to the performance of her holy duties than did Miss N in this season of pestilence. No living creature in the community had any claim upon her, and had she herself been laid on the bed of suffering, it is hard to tell where even she would have found a home, or where a friend to tender her the 100th part of the attentions she had so lavishly bestowed on others. Verily, many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. At the other extremity of the town, for the pestilence had now usurped every quarter, resided 2 brothers and a nephew. The 3 were stretched on the bed of sickness. 2 were taken, and 1 left. It was necessary to remove the bodies at once from the house, and they were conveyed to the Methodist meeting house until coffins could be made. Our town, at all events, had one advantage over this great Babylon. Its inhabitants were not horrified by the awful display of an undertaker's shop. The Methodist meeting house stood on a common, not a house near it, as it was impossible to hire attendants. My husband, after assisting at the house of the brothers, took up his solitary watch with the dead, smoking the whole time in order to dissipate the heavy atmosphere of the building. At twilight the funeral took place, and during this time a lady and a stranger died in the house opposite to that in which laid the surviving brother. This is but a faint sketch of the terrors and trials of that dismal period. Gradually health was restored to our boarders. With a few exceptions, females invariably recovered, as did men of temperate habits. The intemperate were cut down speedily and surely. The disinterested attentions of the Navy surgeons could not be too highly appreciated. Not one would receive compensation for services which elsewhere money could scarcely buy. Our time and our duty are our country's, was the uniform reply of these generous and most skillful men. As soon as practicable, a subscription was opened for the purchase of a set of surgical instruments to be presented to Dr. McLeod. Upon their reception from the North, a meeting of the citizens was called, and the thanks of hundreds of grateful hearts, together with the box, were presented to him who unshrinkingly faced death in its most terrible form, without expectation of honor or reward. Honor to whom honor is due, the devoted Sister of Charity and the fearless sons of the ocean. End of section 5.
Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6. Death at the Toilet. "'Tis no use talking to me, Mother. I will go to that Mrs. P's party tonight, if I die for it. That's flat. You know as well as I do that Lieutenant N is to be there, and he's going to leave town tomorrow, so up I go to dress. Charlotte, why will you be so obstinate? You know how poorly you have been all the week, and Dr. Blank says late hours are the worst things in the world for you." "Pshaw, Mother, nonsense, nonsense. Be persuaded for once, now, I beg. Oh dear, dear, what a night it is, too. It pours with rain, and blows a perfect hurricane. You'll be wet and catch cold, rely on it. Come now, won't you stop and keep me company tonight? That's a good girl. Some other night will do as well for that, you know, for now I'll go to Mrs. P's, if it rains cats and dogs. So up, up, up I go, singing jauntily, 'Oh, she shall dance, all dressed in white, so ladylike.'" Such were very nearly the words and such the manner in which Miss J. expressed her determination to act in defiance of her mother's wishes and entreaties. She was the only child of her widowed mother, and had, but a few weeks before, completed her 26th year, with yet no other prospect before her than bleak single blessedness. A weaker, more frivolous and conceited creature never breathed, the torment of her amiable parent, the nuisance of her acquaintance. Though her mother's circumstances were very straitened, sufficing barely to enable them to maintain a footing in what is called the middling genteel class of society, this young woman contrived by some means or other to gratify her penchant for dress, and gadded about here, there, and everywhere, the most showily dressed person in the neighborhood. Though far from being even pretty-faced, or having any pretensions to a good figure, for she both stooped and was skinny, she yet believed herself handsome, and by a vulgar, flippant forwardness of demeanor, especially when in mixed company, extorted such attentions as persuaded her that others thought so. For 1 or 2 years she had been an occasional patient of mine. The settled pallor, the tallowness of her complexion, conjointly with other symptoms, evidenced the existence of a liver complaint, and the last visits I had paid her were in consequence of frequent sensations of oppression and pain in the chest, which clearly indicated some organic disease of the heart. I saw enough to warrant me in warning her mother of the possibility of her daughter's sudden death from this cause, and the imminent peril to which she exposed herself by dancing, late hours, etc. But Mrs. J.'s remonstrances, gentle and affectionate as they always were thrown away upon her headstrong daughter. It was striking 8 by the church clock when Miss J., humming the song before mentioned, lit her chamber candle by that of her mother, and withdrew to her room to dress, soundly rating the servant girl by the way for not having starched some article or other which she intended to have worn that evening. As her toilet was usually a long and laborious business, it did not occasion much surprise to her mother, who was sitting by the fire in their little parlor, reading some book of devotion, that the church chime announced the first quarter past 9 o'clock without her daughter's making her appearance. The noise she had made overhead in walking to and fro to her drawers, dressing table, etc., had ceased about a half an hour ago, and her mother supposed she was then engaged at her glass, adjusting her hair and preparing her complexion. "Well, I wonder what can make Charlotte so very careful about her dress tonight," exclaimed Mrs. J., removing her eyes from the book and gazing thoughtfully at the fire. "Oh, it must be because young Lieutenant N is to be there. Well, I was young myself once, and it's very excusable in Charlotte. Hey-ho! She heard the wind howling so dismally without that she drew together the coals of her brisk fire and was laying down the poker when the clock of church struck the second quarter after 9. Why, what in the world can Charlotte be doing all this while?" she again inquired. "She listened. I have not heard her moving for the last 3/4 of an hour. I'll call the maid and ask." She rung the bell, and the servant appeared. "Betty, Miss J. is not gone yet, is she?" "La, no, ma'am," replied the girl. "I took up the curling irons only about a quarter of an hour ago, as she had put one of her curls out, and she said she should soon be ready. She's burst her new muslin dress behind, and that has put her into a way, ma'am." "Go up to her room then, Betty, and see if she wants anything, and tell her that it's 9:30 o'clock," said Mrs. J. The servant accordingly went upstairs and knocked at the bedroom door, once, twice, thrice, but received no answer. There was a dead silence, except when the wind shook the window. Could Miss J. have fallen asleep? Oh, impossible. She knocked again, but unsuccessfully as before. She became a little flustered, and after a moment's pause, opened the door and entered. There was Miss J., sitting at the glass. "Why, la, ma'am," commenced Betty in a petulant tone, walking up to her, "here have I been knocking for these 5 minutes, and—" Betty staggered, horror-struck, to the bed, and uttered a loud shriek, alarmed Mrs. J., who instantly tottered upstairs, almost pulsated with fright. Miss J. was dead. I was there within a few minutes, for my house was not more than a few streets distant. It was a stormy night in March, and the desolate aspect of things without, deserted streets, the dreary howling of the wind, and the incessant pattering of the rain, contributed to a cast of gloom over my mind when connected with the intelligence of the awful event that had summoned me out, which was deepened into horror by the spectacle I was doomed to witness. On reaching the house, I found Mrs. J. in violent hysterics, surrounded by several of her neighbors who had been called in to her assistance. I repaired instantly to the scene of death, and beheld what I shall never forget. The room was occupied by a white-curtained bed. There was but one window, and before it was a table on which stood a looking-glass hung with a little white drapery, and various paraphernalia of the toilet lay scattered about, pins, brooches, curling papers, ribbons, gloves, etc. An armchair was drawn to this table, and in it sat Miss J., stone dead. Her head rested upon her right hand, her elbow supported by the table, while her left hung down by her side, grasping a pair of curling irons. Each of her wrists was encircled by a showy gilt bracelet. She was dressed in a white muslin frock with a little bordering of blonde. Her face was turned toward the glass, which, by the light of the expiring candle, reflected with frightful fidelity the clammy fixed features, daubed over with rouge and carmine, the fallen lower jaw, and the eyes directed full into the glass, with a cold, dull stare that was appalling. The hair of the corpse, all smooth and glossy, was curled with elaborate precision, and the skinny, sallow neck was encircled with a string of glistening pearls. the ghastly visage of death thus leering through the tinselry of fashion. The vain show of artificial joy was a horrible mockery of the fooleries of life. Indeed, it was a most humiliating and shocking spectacle. Poor creature, struck dead in the very act of sacrificing at the shrine of female vanity. She must have been dead for some time, perhaps for 20 minutes or half an hour when I arrived, for nearly all the animal heat had deserted the body, which was rapidly stiffening. I attempted, but in vain, to draw a little blood from the arm. 2 or 3 women present proceeded to remove the corpse to the bed for the purpose of laying it out. What strange passiveness! No resistance offered to them while straightening the bent right arm and binding the jaws together with a faded white riband, which Miss J. had destined for her waist that evening. On examination of the body, we found that death had been occasioned by disease of the heart. Her life might have been protracted possibly for years had she but taken my advice and that of her mother. I have seen many hundreds of corpses, as well as the calm composure of natural death, as mangled and distorted by violence, but never have I seen so startling a satire upon human vanity, so repulsive, unsightly, and loathsome a spectacle as a corpse dressed for a ball. End of chapter 6. Read by Brize, Cries, Youngstown, USA, September 17, 2021.
Section 7 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7. Escape of the Duston Family. The history of no people in the world is fuller of stirring and thrilling incidents than that of our North American Indians. The following historical account of the remarkable escape of the Duston family was prepared a few years ago for the American Magazine of Useful Knowledge. The writer, who he is we know not, indulges in some eloquent denunciations against Mrs. Duston for taking the life of her captors when she was about to flee from her captivity. These denunciations we cannot endorse, except to a very limited extent. The destruction of the Indians was the only possible means of her safety. Had she fled while they were sleeping, she could not have gone far before she would have been overtaken, and at once put to death, and probably with extreme tortures. It seems more difficult to find an excuse for her destruction of the children, except in the general sentiment which unfortunately prevailed at that day regarding the savage tribes more as wild beasts of prey than as human beings. Whatever opinions may be formed, however, by those who moralize upon the subject, it is a passage of our early history full of deep and affecting interest. Goodman Duston and his wife, somewhat less than a century and a half ago, dwelt in Haverhill, at that time a small frontier settlement in the province of Massachusetts Bay. They had already added 7 children to the King's liege subjects in America, and Mrs. Duston, about a week before the period of our narrative, had blessed her husband with an 8th. One day in March 1698, when Mr. Duston had gone forth about his ordinary business, there fell out an event which had nearly left him a childless man, and a widower besides. An Indian war party, after traversing the trackless forest all the way from Canada, broke in upon their remote and defenseless town. Goodman Duston heard the war-whoop and alarm, and being on horseback, immediately set of full speed to look after the safety of his family. As he dashed along, he beheld dark wreaths of smoke eddying from the roofs of several dwellings near the roadside, while the groans of dying men, the shrieks of affrighted women, and the screams of children pierced his ear, all mingled with the horrid yell of the raging savages. The poor man trembled, yet spurred on so much the faster, dreading that he should find his own cottage in a blaze, his wife murdered in her bed, and his little ones tossed into the flames. But drawing near the door, he saw his 7 elder children of all ages, between 2 years and 17, issuing out and running down the road to meet him. The father only bade them make the best of their way to the nearest garrison, and without a moment's pause, flung himself from his horse and rushed into Mrs. Duston's bedchamber. The good woman, as we have before hinted, had lately added an 8th to the 7 former proofs of her conjugal affection, and she now lay with the infant in her arms, and her nurse, the widow Mary Neff, watching by her bedside. Such was Mrs. Duston's helpless state when her pale and breathless husband burst into the chamber, bidding her instantly to rise and flee for her life. Scarcely were the words out of his mouth when the Indian yell was heard, and staring wildly out of the window, Goodman Duston saw that the bloodthirsty foe was close at hand. At this terrible instant, it appears that the thought of his children's danger rushed so powerfully upon his heart that he quite forgot the still more perilous situation of his wife, or, as is not improbable, he had such knowledge of the good lady's character as afforded him a comfortable hope that she would hold her own, even in a contest with a whole tribe of Indians. However that might be, he seized his gun and rushed out of doors again, meaning to gallop after his 7 children and snatch up one of them in his flight, lest his whole race and generation should be blotted from the earth in that fatal hour. With this idea, he rode up behind them, swift as the wind. They had, by this time, got about 40 rods from the house, all pressing forward in a group, and though the younger children tripped and stumbled, yet the older ones were not prevailed upon by fear or death to take to their heels and leave these poor little souls to perish. Hearing the tramp of hoofs in their rear, they looked round, and espying Goodman Duston, they all suddenly stopped. The little ones stretched out their arms, while the elder boys and girls, as it were, resigned their charge into his hands, and all the 7 children seemed to say, "Here is our father. Now we are safe." But if ever a poor mortal was in trouble, and perplexity, and anguish of spirit, that man was Mr. Duston. He felt his heart yearn toward these 7 poor, helpless children, as if each were singly possessed of his whole affections, for not one among them all but had some peculiar claim to their dear father's love. There was his firstborn. There, too, the little one, who, till within a week past, had been a baby. There was a girl with her mother's features, and a boy, the picture of himself, and another in which the looks of both parents were mingled. There was one child whom he loved for his mild, quiet, and holy disposition, and another whom he loved not less for his rough and fearless spirit. and who, could he live to be a man, would do a man's part against these bloody Indians. Goodman Duston looked at the poor things one by one, and with yearning fondness he looked at them all together. He then gazed up to heaven for a moment, and finally waved his hand to his 7 beloved ones. "Go on, my children," said he calmly. "We will live or die together." He reined in his horse and caused him to walk behind the children, who, hand in hand, went onward, hushing their sobs and wailings, lest these sounds should bring the savages upon them. Nor was it long before the fugitives had proof that the red devils had found their track. There was a curl of smoke from behind the huge trunk of a tree. A sudden and sharp report echoed through the woods, and a bullet hissed over Goodman Duston's shoulder and passed above the children's heads. The father, turning half round on his horse, took aim and fired at the skulking foe with such effect as to cause a momentary delay of the pursuit. Another shot and another whistled from the covert of the forest. But still the little band pressed on, unharmed, and the stealthy nature of the Indians forbade them to rush boldly forward in the face of so firm an enemy as Goodman Duston. Thus he and his 7 children continued their retreat, creeping along, as Cotton Mather observes, at the pace of a child of 5 years old, till the stockades of a little frontier fortress appeared in view, and the savages gave up the chase. We must not forget Mrs. Duston in her distress. Scarcely had her husband fled from the house ere the chamber was thronged with the horrible visages of the wild Indians, bedaubed with paint and besmeared with blood, brandishing their tomahawks in her face, and threatening to add her scalp to those that were already hanging at their girdles. It was, however, their interest to save her alive, if the thing might be, in order to exact a ransom. Our great-great-grandmothers, when taken captive in the old times of Indian warfare, appear, in 9 cases out of 10, to have been in pretty much such a delicate situation as Mrs. Duston, notwithstanding which they were wonderfully sustained through long, rough, and hurried marches, amid toil, weariness, and starvation, such as the Indians themselves could hardly endure. Seeing that there was no help for it, Mrs. Duston rose, and she and the widow Neff, with the infant in her arms, followed their captors out of doors. As they crossed the threshold, the poor babe set up a feeble wail. It was its death cry. In an instant, an Indian seized it by the heels, swung it in the air, dashed out its brains against the trunk of the nearest tree, and threw the little corpse at the mother's feet. Perhaps it was the remembrance of that moment that hardened Hannah Duston's heart when her time of vengeance came. But now nothing could be done but to stifle her grief and rage within her bosom, and follow the Indians into the dark gloom of the forest, hardly venturing to throw a parting glance at the blazing cottage where she had dwelt happily with her husband, and had borne him 8 children, the 7 of whose fate she knew nothing, and the infant whom she had just seen murdered. The first day's march was 15 miles, and during that and many succeeding days, Mrs. Duston kept pace with her captors, for, had she lagged behind, a tomahawk would at once have sunk into her brains. More than one terrible warning was given her. More than one of her fellow captives, of whom there were many, after tottering feebly, at length sank upon the ground. The next moment the death groan was breathed, and the scalp was reeking at an Indian's girdle. The unburied corpse was left in the forest, till the rites of sepulture should be performed by the autumnal gales, strewing the withered leaves upon the whitened bones. When, out of danger of immediate pursuit, the prisoners, according to Indian custom, were divided among different parties of the savages, each of whom were to shift for themselves. Mrs. Duston, the widow Neff, and an English lad fell to the lot of a family consisting of 2 stout warriors, 3 squaws, and 7 children. These Indians, like most with whom the French had held intercourse, were Catholics, and Cotton Mather affirms, on Mrs. Duston's authority, that they prayed at morning, noon, and night, nor ever partook of food without a prayer, nor suffered their children to sleep till they had prayed to the Christians' God. Mather, like an old, hard-hearted, pedantic bigot, as he was, seems trebly to exult in the destruction of these poor wretches on account of their popish superstitions. Yet what can be more touching than to think of these wild Indians in their loneliness and their wanderings, wherever they went among the dark, mysterious woods, still keeping up domestic worship with all the regularity of a household at its peaceful fireside. They were traveling to a rendezvous of the savages somewhere in the northeast. One night, being now above 100 miles from Haverfield, the red men and the women and the little red children and the 3 pale-faces, Mrs. Duston, the widow Neff, and the English lad, made their encampment and kindled a fire beneath the gloomy old trees on a small island in Contoocook River. The barbarians sat down to what scanty food Providence had sent them, and shared it with their prisoners, as if they had all been the children of one wigwam, and had grown up together on the margin of the same river, within the shadow of the forest. Then the Indians said their prayers, the prayers that the Romish priests had taught them, and made the sign of the cross upon their dusky breasts, and composed themselves to rest. But the 3 prisoners prayed apart, and when their petitions were ended, they likewise lay down, with their feet to the fire. The night wore on, and the light and cautious slumbers of the red men were often broken by the rush and ripple of the stream, or the groaning and moaning of the forest, as if nature were wailing over her wild children. And sometimes, too, the little redskins cried in sleep, and the Indian mothers awoke to hush them. But a little before break of day, a deep, dead slumber fell upon the Indians. "See," cries Cotton Mather triumphantly, "if it prove not so." Up rose Mrs. Duston, holding her own breath to listen to the long, deep breathing of her captors. Then she stirred the widow Neff, whose place was by her own, and likewise the English lad, and all 3 stood up, with the doubtful gleam of the decaying fire hovering upon their ghastly visages, as they stared round at the fated slumberers. The next instant, each of the three captives held a tomahawk. Hark! That low moan, as one in a troubled dream. It told a warrior's death pang. Another, and the third half-uttered groan was from a woman's lips. But oh, the children! Their skins are red, yet spare them, Hannah Duston, spare those 7 little ones, for the sake of the 7 that have fed at your own breast. 7, quoth Mrs. Duston to herself. 8 children have I borne, and where are the 7? And where is the 8th? The thought nerved her arm, and the copper-colored babes slept the same dead sleep with their Indian mothers. Of all that family, only one woman escaped, dreadfully wounded, and fled shrieking into the wilderness, and a boy, whom it is said Mrs. Duston had meant to save alive. But he did well to flee from the raging tigress. There was little safety for a redskin when Hannah Duston's blood was up. The work being finished, Mrs. Duston laid hold of the long black hair of the warriors, and the women, and the children, and took all their 10 scalps, and left the island, which bears her name to this very day. According to our notion, it should be held accursed for her sake. Would that the bloody old hag had been drowned in crossing Contrecook River, or that she had sunk over head and ears in a swamp and been there buried, till summoned forth to confront her victims at the day of judgment, or that she had gone astray and been starved to death in the forest, and nothing ever seen of her again, save her skeleton with the 10 scalps twisted round it for a girdle. But on the contrary, she and her companions came safe home, and received the bounty on the dead Indians, besides liberal presents from private gentlemen, and 50 pounds from the governor of Maryland. In her old age, being sunk into decayed circumstances, she claimed, and we believe, received a pension as a further price of blood. This awful woman, and that tender-hearted yet valiant man, her husband, will be remembered as long as the deeds of old times are told round a New England fireside. But how different is her renown from his. End of section 7, read by Carrie Adams, your book voice, at Mesa, Arizona, on the 21st of November, 2021.
Section 8 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8. The Florentine Mother. Teresa Balducci, a lady of a noble Florentine family, had not been long a widow before she beheld her 2 sons, the inheritors of an ample patrimony, independent of her. To a mother endued with every virtue, and awake to the nicest touches of maternal sensibility, the independence of her sons, exposed by their very opulence to all the varieties of temptation, must have been extremely alarming, even if their dispositions had appeared at their outset to be the most happy and promising. But what must have been her anxiety, what her terrors, when all of Florence soon distinguished them as foremost among the profligate and abandoned. In vain did she repeat the most earnest expostulations. in vain have recourse to entreaties, or give vent to her agony in tears. Her voice was no longer heard, nor did the affecting effusions of maternal grief make the slightest impression. Her eldest son continued at Florence, while the youngest left that city in order to make the tour of Italy. One evening, this disconsolate mother being alone, now lost in thought, and now weeping at the licentiousness of her sons, she was surprised on a sudden with the appearance of a stranger with a bloody sword in his hand, and paleness, distraction, and terror on his countenance. Terrified at this unexpected and frightful object, she endeavoured to retire. The stranger hastily followed her, and threw himself at her feet. "Ah," he said, "have pity on an unfortunate man. I am a Roman. I have been in this city 2 days, and having finished the business which brought me hither, I was going to my inn in order to prepare for my departure, when a person, passing by me, kicked me with great brutality. On remonstrating with him against this incivility, he added insult to outrage. On resenting this treatment, he grew more abusive than before, and threatened me with such insolence that I could no longer contain myself. I drew my sword, he drew his, and in an instant fell pierced by my first thrust. Heaven can witness my grief at this involuntary murder. Distracted, scarce sensible of what I did, not knowing whither to fly, I have ventured to seek an asylum in your house, the door of which I found accidentally open. Oh, madam, pity an unfortunate man. Permit me to take refuge here till the pursuit is over, and the darkness of the night may allow me to retire with safety." At this recital, the good Teresa Balducci trembled with horror, and an unaccountable presentiment filled her mind with 1,000 cruel apprehensions. Nevertheless, attentive only to the suggestions of compassion and humanity, she conducted the stranger to a closet in which she carefully concealed him. The forebodings of this unfortunate mother were but too well founded. In a little time she was again struck by a sudden bustle and noise. Pale and trembling, she hastened to the hall, and there beheld, what a sight for a mother, her eldest son brought before her, pierced by a deep wound in his breast, and weltering in his blood. She uttered a dreadful shriek. Her son, almost lifeless, perceiving himself just expiring, made a last effort, and turning to his mother, "Alas," said he, "you behold in me an example of the just punishment of heaven. I have deserved my fate. Let my death serve at least as a warning to my brother. If the person who killed me is apprehended, I entreat you to undertake his defence. My mother, he is innocent. I alone am the aggressor." At these words he expired. The unhappy mother sunk senseless on the body. Her attendants at last forced her from the bloody corpse, uncertain, however, for a long time whether she were yet living. It was with the greatest difficulty she was brought to herself. Her anguish must have been insupportable, but that it found vent at last in a flood of tears. She kept calling every moment for her son. She repeatedly insisted upon seeing him again, and it was not without violence that she was removed from the shocking sight. What, in the meantime, must have been the grief and consternation of the young stranger, who, from the place of his concealment, heard the whole tragical scene of which he had been the cause. In the distracting idea that he was the author of the calamity of this respectable mother, he regretted that he had not fallen under the sword of his adversary. On the other hand, the fear of being discovered chilled his blood at the least motion or the slightest noise. He remained in this perplexity till about midnight. All being quiet then, and the first emotions of maternal grief having given place to reflection, Teresa went to the closet. She opened it. The young man prostrated himself at her feet. "I call heaven to witness," said he, "that I would give my blood." "Rise," said Teresa. "You have made me the most wretched of mothers, but I know your innocence. My son has charged me to protect you, and it is my duty to do it. A carriage will be here presently, and one of my servants shall conduct you to the frontiers. This purse will supply your wants. May heaven grant you that peace of which you have deprived me." The young Roman, inexpressibly affected by this exalted instance of generosity, felt a deeper impression of grief. "Alas," said he, "I can never forgive myself for having involved in misery such a mother, such an excellent woman." He poured forth 1,000 wishes for her welfare. He kissed again and again her beneficent hand, and he left her in tears, resolved to seize every opportunity which fortune might offer to prove his regret and gratitude. Nor did he long wait for this opportunity. When he had passed Viterbo, he beheld a young man attacked by 2 robbers, against whom he defended himself with difficulty. He leapt from the carriage and flew to his assistance. The robbers fled, but the young man was wounded. He took him into his carriage and returned to Viterbo. Fortunately, the wound was not dangerous. It was soon healed, and 1,000 times he thanked his deliverer. But who can describe the consolation and joy which the young Roman felt when he found that he had saved the brother of the very man whom he had killed in Florence? He embraced him affectionately. "What thanks," said he, "do I owe to heaven, which has thus graciously afforded me the means of acknowledging, in some measure, the goodness of your adorable mother. It will be impressed for ever on my heart. Hasten to see her once more. Your presence is necessary. She impatiently expects you. Tell her that the man whose life she preserved has had the happiness to expose it for you, and that it is still his ardent wish to employ the remainder of it in the service of both." Arrived at Florence, it was a painful surprise to the young Balducci to hear from his mother an account of all that had happened. He could not recollect, in the same person, the destroyer of his brother and his own deliverer, without feeling the most contradictory emotions. But the proofs which he had of his innocence lessened the horror with which he at first regarded him, and the gratitude he had felt for his own preservation resumed all its force. While he deplored the death of his brother, he was not less assiduous to take every measure to procure the acquittal of the young Roman. In the meantime, the death of his brother, and his own imminent danger, made a deep impression on young Balducci. He perceived all the perils to which youth is exposed from a rash and inconsiderate conduct. He entirely changed the course of his life, and by a virtuous and exemplary conduct, from that moment he consoled his mother at last for the great loss she had sustained. End of section 8. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 9 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 24. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 24, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 9, Pulpit Ingenuity. A preacher in the neighborhood of Blackfriars, London, not undeservedly popular, had just finished an exhortation strongly recommending the support of a certain very meritorious institution. The congregation was numerous and the chapel crowded to excess. The discourse being finished, the plate was about to be handed round to the respective pews, when the preacher made this short address to the congregation. From the sympathy I have witnessed in your countenances, and the strict attention you have honored me with, there is only one thing I am afraid of, that some of you may be inclined to give too much. Now it is my duty to inform you that justice, though not so pleasant, should always be a prior virtue to generosity. Therefore, as you will all be immediately waited upon in your respective pews, I wish to have it thoroughly understood that no person will think of putting anything into the plate who cannot pay his debts. I need not add that this produced a most overflowing collection. End of section 9. End of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 24, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.